The Lusitania did not single-handedly bring the United States into the First World War, and that is exactly why the sinking matters. If one shipwreck could have made war inevitable, the story would be simpler. A liner is torpedoed. Civilians die. A neutral nation rises in anger. The path from ocean disaster to battlefield seems direct, but history rarely moves so cleanly. The United States did not declare war on Germany in 1915. President Woodrow Wilson did not ask Congress for war after the Lusitania went down. American soldiers did not cross the Atlantic because of that one May afternoon alone. And yet, after the Lusitania, neutrality could never feel quite the same. A British passenger liner had left New York bound for Liverpool. It carried civilians, crew, baggage, mail, expectations, and the prestige of one of the most famous shipping lines in the world. It was not a battleship in the public imagination. It was RMS Lusitania, a Cunard liner, a ship associated with speed, luxury, and the confident machinery of transatlantic travel. But by May of 1915, the Atlantic had changed around it. Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone. German submarine warfare was challenging older assumptions about what could happen to ships at sea and to the civilians aboard them. Before Lusitania sailed, the German embassy had published warnings in American newspapers, cautioning travelers about the danger of passage through that war zone on British or Allied ships. The warning did not stop the voyage. It did not empty the passenger lists. It did not erase the old belief that a great passenger liner belonged to a different moral category than a warship. That belief would be tested off the southern coast of Ireland. On May 7, 1915, near the old head of Kinsale, German submarine U-20 torpedoed Lusitania. The attack came without the ship first being stopped and evacuated under the older prize rule practice that many civilians still imagined as the proper law of the sea. The torpedo struck the starboard side. Witnesses and later accounts described a second, larger, or different explosion soon afterward. Then the great liner began to die with astonishing speed. Lusitania sank in about 18 minutes, sometimes described as within 20 minutes. That time matters. It is one of the reasons the disaster still feels unreal. The ship had crossed oceans. It had embodied the scale and confidence of the age of the liner. Yet after the torpedo strike, the window for escape narrowed almost immediately. A passenger ship carrying hundreds of civilians became, in less time than a short walk across a city, a mass casualty disaster at sea. The death toll is reported with small variations by different institutions and histories, generally around 1,191 to 1,198. It is often rounded to roughly 1,200 dead. Among them were approximately 128 American citizens. For Britain, the sinking was a catastrophe and a propaganda weapon. For Germany, it was defended through the language of war zones, British shipping, and cargo. For the United States, still officially neutral, it was something more difficult, a confrontation with the fact that modern war did not remain neatly separated from civilian movement, private travel, or national innocence. That is the central tension of the Lusitania story. It was a passenger liner, but it sailed under a British flag during a global war. It carried civilians, but sources agree it also carried ammunition or war material, a fact Germany used in its defense and propaganda. It was famous for elegant transatlantic service, but it entered waters Germany had declared dangerous. It was not the single cause of America's entry into the First World War, but it became one of the events that pushed American opinion, American diplomacy, and American ideas of neutral rights closer to rupture. The sinking forced Americans to ask uncomfortable questions. Could a neutral citizen safely travel on a belligerent passenger ship? Did Germany's public warning shift responsibility onto passengers who still chose to sail? Could submarine warfare be conducted under older rules that required stopping a ship and allowing evacuation before destruction? Or had the submarine, by its very nature, brought a harsher logic to the sea? There were no easy answers in the spring of 1915. The United States traded, traveled, argued, and watched the European war from across the Atlantic. American neutrality was not indifference. It was a policy under pressure, and Lusitania became one of the sharpest points of pressure. Newspapers carried the shock. Public anger rose. The loss of American lives gave the disaster a direct emotional force that no diplomatic note could fully contain. But Wilson's administration responded first with protest, not war. The United States demanded that Germany protect American lives and respect neutral rights. The crisis deepened, but the final break would not come until 1917, after renewed unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Zimmermann telegram helped create the broader emergency that led to the American declaration of war on April 6, 1917. That later timeline is essential. To say Lusitania pulled America toward war is not to say it dragged the country there in a single motion. It hardened attitudes. It made submarine warfare a public moral question. It turned civilian vulnerability into an image that could be repeated in speeches, posters, newspapers, and memory. It placed the deaths of approximately 128 Americans inside a conflict the United States was still trying not to enter. And it exposed a contradiction that neither side could easily escape. Germany argued that Lusitania was a British ship in a declared war zone and that it carried war materiel. Britain and its supporters emphasized the destruction of a passenger liner and the deaths of civilians. Americans had to confront both the legal arguments and the human result. A warning had been published, but passengers had still boarded. War cargo was aboard, but so were families, travelers, crew members, and citizens of a neutral country. The ocean liner was not merely a ship. It was a stage where modern warfare, international law, imperial commerce, and public emotion collided. That is why the Lusitania cannot be understood only at the moment it was struck. The torpedo is the dramatic center, but the meaning of the disaster was built before the attack and contested long after the ship disappeared. It began with a liner designed for the Great Atlantic route between Liverpool and New York. It unfolded in a war zone declared around Britain. It became a diplomatic crisis in Washington, a propaganda battle in Britain and Germany, and a memory that outlived the war itself. The image is almost too stark. A celebrated passenger liner nearing the end of its crossing, the Irish coast not far away, struck beneath the surface by a weapon that represented a new age of naval war. Above the waterline were people who had trusted schedules, tickets, reputations, and the long habits of ocean travel. Below the waterline was the force that made those habits obsolete. In that collision, Lusitania became more than a wreck. It became evidence that the First World War was changing the boundaries of danger. The battlefield had reached the passenger lane. The ocean, once imagined by travelers as a space of distance and passage, had become a contested zone where civilian life could be destroyed in minutes. Before the disaster can be followed to its final afternoon, the ship itself has to be seen as its passengers saw it, not as a doomed symbol, but as one of the proudest liners afloat. A Royal Mail ship of the Cunard line, built for speed, scale, and imperial confidence, Lusitania had entered the world as a marvel of engineering and prestige. Its tragedy begins with that contradiction. The more powerful and magnificent the ship seemed, the more shocking it became that it could vanish so quickly. To understand why Lusitania's destruction struck so deeply, it helps to return to the moment before she became a symbol of loss. Before the torpedo, before the diplomatic notes, before the newspaper outrage, she was an object of confidence. Her name belonged to the age of the great Atlantic liners, when nations measured prestige not only in armies and empires, but in the ships they could send across the ocean. Lusitania was a Royal Mail ship of the Cunard line. Those letters, RMS, were not decoration. They placed her inside an imperial system of communication, commerce, and movement. She carried people, but she also carried the authority of a regular connection between Britain and the wider world. To board a Cunard liner was to enter a carefully managed Atlantic machine, one that linked Liverpool and New York with timetables, mail contracts, passenger lists, cargo spaces, dining rooms, and enormous engines hidden below decks. She was launched on June 7, 1906, and entered service in 1907. Her maiden voyage carried her from Liverpool to New York in September of that year. By then, the transatlantic passenger trade was more than transportation. It was a public contest. British, German, and other European shipping companies competed for the richest and most visible route in the world, the crossing between Europe and North America. Speed mattered because it shortened the ocean. Luxury mattered because it made the crossing desirable. Reliability mattered because the Atlantic was not a pleasure pond, but a vast and changeable sea that had to be mastered again and again. Cunard built Lusitania for that world. She was not simply large. She was meant to appear inevitable, as if the industrial power of the early 20th century had taken shape in steel, smoke, polished wood, and brass. Her hull was roughly 787 feet long, a length that would have made her presence at a pier feel less like the arrival of a vessel than the arrival of a district of a city. Her tonnage was later cited by Britannica at about 31,550 tons. Even these measurements, though useful, flatten the experience. A passenger approaching Lusitania would not have seen a statistic. They would have seen height, shadow, funnels, rigging, rows of portholes, and the dark promise of a ship built to cross an ocean on schedule. Her reputation came from the pairing of luxury and speed. The great liners did not merely carry first-class passengers and comfort. They staged a version of modern life at sea. They suggested that the ocean could be disciplined, that distance could be softened by service, architecture, and engineering. The passenger decks, public rooms, and private spaces all belonged to that illusion of command. A traveler could dine, sleep, read, walk, and socialize, while unseen forces below drove the ship westward or eastward across thousands of miles of water. But the quieter heart of Lusitania's identity was mechanical. Her prestige rested not only on what passengers could see, but on what they could feel through the steady vibration of the hull. She used Parsons steam turbines, a technology that marked her as modern. Steam turbines converted the force of high-pressure steam into rotary motion, and on Lusitania, that power was delivered to quadruple screws. 4 propellers drove the ship through the Atlantic, giving her speed and a kind of muscular grace that became part of her legend. Below, large Scotch boilers produced the steam that fed the turbines. Those boilers belonged to the hidden city of labor beneath the glamour: fire, heat, coal, pressure, gauges, pipes, valves, and men working in the harshest spaces of the ship. The public image of Lusitania was one of elegance, but her movement depended on industrial intensity. Every fast crossing required fuel, discipline, maintenance, and risk. The polished surfaces above deck were inseparable from the boiler rooms and engine rooms below. That engineering scale mattered because Lusitania became associated with one of the most admired honors in ocean travel, the Blue Riband. The Blue Riband was not a formal trophy in the simple sense, but a celebrated reputation for fast Atlantic crossing performance. To hold or be associated with such a record meant that a liner had done more than complete a route. It had challenged the ocean itself and the public imagination. Newspapers, shipping companies, travelers, and rival lines understood what it meant. A fast liner was a national advertisement. It showed that a company, and by extension a country, could build, fund, crew, and operate a machine of extraordinary power. In that sense, Lusitania was also an expression of empire. Not empire in the abstract, but empire as routine movement, mail moving under contract, passengers crossing between continents, commercial schedules maintained, despite weather and distance, British maritime confidence displayed in steel. Cunard's great liner was part of a system that assumed the sea could be organized. The North Atlantic had always been dangerous, but by the early 20th century, the largest liners made dangers seem manageable. Their size suggested safety. Their speed suggested escape. Their luxury suggested order. This is one reason the later sinking would feel so violent to the public mind. Lusitania was not a small, anonymous vessel lost in wartime confusion. She was famous. She was known as fast. She belonged to a route that many people understood, even if they never crossed it themselves. Liverpool to New York, New York to Liverpool, the route carried migrants, business travelers, tourists, families, public figures, mail, and goods. It was a corridor between worlds. Lusitania helped give that corridor a sense of permanence. The ship's scale can still be glimpsed through surviving material memory. National Museum's Liverpool holds a recovered 4-bladed portside propeller from Lusitania, weighing about 22.5 tons. A propeller is not a room where passengers gathered, nor a printed schedule, nor a glamorous advertisement. It is a piece of machinery made to do work in darkness. Yet it tells the story plainly. Lusitania's identity was not merely decorative. It was forged in metal and force. Her power was physical, measurable, and immense. The passengers who later chose to travel aboard her did so with that reputation behind them. They were not boarding an experiment. They were boarding a liner with a history of Atlantic service, a Cunard vessel whose name carried prestige. The ship had entered service years before the war, and her fame belonged to the pre-war world of ocean competition. By the time she sailed her final voyage from New York toward Liverpool, that older identity still clung to her. She was a passenger ship, a mail ship, a luxury liner, a fast liner, and a British ship. In peacetime, those categories had worked together smoothly. In wartime, they began to pull against one another. That tension is important. Lusitania's beauty and engineering did not protect her from politics. Her speed did not remove her from the war zone Germany had declared around Britain. Her civilian passengers did not erase the fact that she sailed under the British flag in a global conflict. Her prestige, once a shield in the imagination, became part of the shock. The more she represented command over distance, the more unbearable it seemed that she could be struck beneath the waterline and sink so rapidly. There is a temptation, when looking backward, to see her only as doomed. But that is not how she was built, advertised, or remembered before May of 1915. Lusitania was created for movement, not martyrdom. She belonged to a confident Atlantic culture that believed great liners could make the ocean regular, elegant, and swift. Her turbines, quadruple screws, Scotch boilers, long hull, and blue ribband reputation all told the same story. The modern liner was one of the supreme achievements of its age. And so, before Lusitania entered the most dangerous waters of her final voyage, she carried with her the weight of an older belief. Large liners seemed different from warships. Passenger routes seemed different from battle lines. The Atlantic crossing seemed governed by customs, expectations, and habits built over decades of ocean travel. That world had made Lusitania possible. The war would test whether it still existed. That older belief was not abstract. It had a geography, a timetable, and a kind of social ritual. Lusitania belonged to the North Atlantic Passage between Liverpool and New York, a route that was more than a line on a chart. It was one of the great corridors of the modern world, carrying passengers, mail, news, money, expectations, and status between Europe and America. To book passage on a Cunard liner was not simply to cross an ocean. It was to enter a system that promised order against distance, comfort against uncertainty, and speed against the old terror of the sea. By the early 20th century, the Atlantic had been made to feel almost scheduled. Not safe in an absolute sense, because the ocean never surrendered that much authority, but regular enough that passengers could think in terms of departure dates and arrival days, rather than storms, wrecks, and disappearance. Liners like Lusitania helped create that confidence. They were built not only to move across water, but to make the crossing feel civilized. Their size mattered. Their speed mattered. Their names mattered. Each voyage was part of a repeated performance, and repetition has a powerful effect on human judgment. What happens often begins to feel natural. What happens on schedule begins to feel protected. Lusitania's own history reinforced that feeling. Her maiden voyage had been from Liverpool to New York in September of 1907, placing her directly into the prestigious transatlantic passenger trade for which she had been designed. The ship's identity was tied to both ends of the route. Liverpool represented Cunard's British base and the imperial maritime world from which the liner emerged. New York represented the American gateway, the busy harbor through which travelers, businessmen, families, and public figures moved between continents. On the ocean between them, Lusitania was not a wandering vessel. She was a known presence on a known passage. For wealthy travelers, the great Atlantic liner could resemble a floating hotel, a place where the discomforts of distance were softened by architecture, service, and routine. The luxury of such ships was part of their public meaning. A passenger could walk aboard and feel, at least for a time, that the world had been arranged into decks, cabins, dining rooms, promenades, and schedules. The liner turned the Atlantic into a social space. It gave passengers places to dress, dine, read, write letters, speak with strangers, and watch the sea from a position of apparent command. Even those traveling without the privileges of the highest class were carried within the larger confidence of the ship itself. The vessel's mass and machinery suggested protection. Its reputation suggested competence. Its company suggested responsibility. This confidence was not foolish in the way it can appear after disaster. It rested on decades of experience in which passenger liners had become central to transatlantic life. They were symbols of national pride, but they were also instruments of ordinary movement. People crossed for business, for family, for work, for performance, for diplomacy, for return. The route connected private lives to global systems. In peacetime, a liner could be celebrated as a triumph of engineering and commerce. It existed in a world where civilian passage and naval conflict were understood as different realms, even if they shared the same ocean. That distinction mattered deeply. Long before submarines brought a new kind of danger, maritime war had developed customs around the stopping and searching of ships. Older prize rule practice rested on the assumption that a vessel might be halted, examined, and if it was to be destroyed, people aboard would be given a chance to escape. Such rules did not make war gentle, and they did not erase the brutalities of blockade, seizure, or naval power. But they did help preserve a moral and legal boundary in the public mind. Warships fought. Merchant and passenger vessels might be detained, searched, or captured. Civilians at sea were not supposed to be treated as if they were simply part of a battlefield. The First World War placed enormous pressure on that boundary. Britain, Germany, and the other belligerent powers were fighting a war that reached far beyond trenches and battle fleets. Commerce, food, raw materials, shipping lanes, and national survival were all tied together. The sea was not a backdrop. It was an arena of pressure. The old Atlantic, organized around passenger schedules and imperial trade, was now overlaid by a new strategic map. A familiar route could become a military problem. A civilian liner could become, in the eyes of an enemy government, part of a hostile maritime system. Germany's declaration that the waters around Britain were a war zone transformed the meaning of approach to the British Isles. This declaration did not physically change the sea. The Irish coast still stood where it had stood. Liverpool was still a destination. New York remained a departure point. But politically and militarily, the waters through which Lusitania would have to pass had been reclassified. They were no longer merely the final stretch of a passenger voyage. They had become contested space, where German submarine warfare challenged the old expectation that a liner would be treated differently from a warship. The submarine was central to that challenge. A U-boat did not operate like a traditional surface cruiser. It was small compared with the great ships it hunted, and its power came from concealment and sudden attack. To stop a vessel, surface, inspect papers, allow evacuation, and then destroy the ship under older assumptions could expose the submarine to danger. The weapon's logic pushed toward surprise. But surprise, when applied to passenger traffic, carried a terrible moral cost. It compressed decision, warning, and death into moments. It turned the sea from a space of interception into a space of unseen threat. This is the world Lusitania entered in 1915. She was still the famous Cunard liner, still associated with speed, luxury, and the Liverpool to New York crossing. She was still a Royal Mail ship, still part of a system that treated the Atlantic as a route to be served, not merely a battlefield to be survived. Yet the assumptions surrounding her were no longer secure. The war had not abolished civilian travel, but it had made civilian travel politically charged. The United States remained neutral, and Americans could still board British ships. That fact alone reveals the tension of the moment. Neutral citizens moved through a war shaped by nations to which they did not officially belong. For many passengers, the distinction between civilian and military remained persuasive. Lusitania was not imagined by the traveling public in the same category as a battleship. Her decks, cabins, and dining rooms did not look like instruments of combat. Her advertisements and reputation belonged to the world of liners, not naval engagements. To those who trusted her, the ship's very identity seemed to argue for restraint. She carried civilians. She sailed a regular route. She was known across the Atlantic. Surely, such a vessel, even in wartime, occupied a protected moral category. But Germany's position was moving in another direction. A British ship entering waters declared dangerous by Germany could be seen not through the eyes of its passengers, but through the logic of war at sea. The fact that Lusitania was famous did not necessarily protect her. The fact that she carried civilians did not necessarily remove her from the calculations of blockade, submarine patrol, and enemy shipping. In the presence of war materiel aboard, later central to Germany's argument, would further complicate the way the sinking was defended and condemned. The liner existed in several realities at once: passenger ship, British vessel, commercial carrier, symbol of prestige, and object within a widening naval war. This overlap is what made the final voyage so historically explosive. If Lusitania had been understood by everyone as a warship, the attack would have meant one thing. If she had been traveling in a peaceful Atlantic, her sinking would have meant another. But she moved between those meanings. Her passengers inhabited the older culture of the Atlantic crossing, while the German war zone declaration imposed a new and harsher interpretation on the same waters. The ship's route had not changed in essence. The world around the route had. The confidence placed in great liners was therefore not merely personal optimism. It was inherited from a whole era of maritime order. People trusted ships like Lusitania because modern liners had taught them to trust. They trusted companies, captains, engines, schedules, and the visible grandeur of steel. They trusted the idea that civilian passage had rules around it, even in war. They trusted that the Atlantic, for all its storms, was a known road between Liverpool and New York. By the spring of 1915, that trust had begun to collide with warnings that were public, direct, and impossible to dismiss completely. Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone, and German officials were prepared to say so in a form ordinary travelers could read before they sailed. The old world of the liner had not disappeared. It was still there at the pier, in the ticket, in the baggage, in the confidence of departure. But now, printed beside the habits of ordinary travel, there would be another message, a warning that the ocean ahead was no longer protected by the assumptions that had once made the Atlantic feel safe. The warning did not arrive as a secret telegram or a whispered rumor at the dock. It appeared in public, in the ordinary machinery of American newspaper life, among the notices, advertisements, shipping news, and war reports that readers could hold in their hands. By the spring of 1915, the danger surrounding the British Isles had moved from diplomatic language into print. Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone, and the German embassy in the United States wanted travelers to understand that this declaration was not symbolic. Before Lusitania sailed from New York, warnings were published in American newspapers, cautioning passengers about the risks of traveling through that war zone on British or Allied ships. The notice was stark in its implication. A civilian passenger could buy a ticket. A great liner could still keep its schedule. Cunard could still send ships across the Atlantic. But Germany was saying that the old habits of ocean travel no longer guaranteed safety. This is one reason the Lusitania story has never been simple. The ship was not attacked without any public warning that danger existed. Travelers had been cautioned. The warning was not hidden after the fact. It had appeared before the final voyage, in the open, where passengers, families, travel agents, diplomats, and newspaper readers could see it. And yet many people still boarded. To understand why, we have to pause inside the world those passengers inhabited. A printed warning was one kind of reality. The transatlantic liner was another. For decades, ships like Lusitania had represented order, scale, and confidence. They connected New York and Liverpool through regular service, familiar routes, known companies, and advertised schedules. Passengers did not think of themselves as entering a battlefield in the way a soldier did. They were crossing an ocean on a passenger ship, with cabins, dining rooms, luggage, mail, officers, stewards, and all the visible routines of civilian travel. That distinction mattered deeply. In public imagination, a passenger liner occupied a different moral and legal category from a warship. Warships were instruments of national violence. Merchant vessels and passenger liners might belong to nations at war, and they might carry cargo that raised difficult questions, but they also carried civilians: men, women, children, business travelers, immigrants, crew, and citizens of neutral countries. The belief that such people should not simply be destroyed at sea had not vanished just because Europe was at war. Germany's warning challenged that belief directly. It told travelers that British and Allied ships passing through the declared war zone were exposed to danger. It made the passenger, not only the captain or the government, part of the calculation. If a person chose to sail, Germany could later argue that the risk had been publicly stated. But a warning is not the same as consent to death. That distinction would become central to the outrage that followed. Many Americans could acknowledge that the warning had been printed and still feel that the destruction of a passenger liner without first stopping and evacuating the ship violated something fundamental. The old practice associated with naval warfare expected ships to be stopped, searched, and if necessary, passengers and crews given a chance to leave before destruction. Submarine warfare made that practice far more difficult. A U-boat could not easily surface beside a large liner, manage civilians, and remain safe from danger. But the technological problem did not erase the moral shock. In this way, the newspaper warning became one of the most important details in the Lusitania case because it sharpened both sides of the argument. For Germany, it supported the claim that the waters around Britain had been declared dangerous and that travelers had been cautioned not to sail on British or Allied vessels. For critics of Germany, it sounded less like a safety notice than a public threat against civilian travel. The same printed words could be read as a warning, a legal defense, or an admission of intent. The warning also exposed the uncomfortable position of the United States in 1915. The United States was still neutral. American citizens could still travel aboard British ships. American businesses and passengers still moved through a world shaped by older commercial ties, even as the European war spread across sea lanes. Neutrality did not mean isolation from danger. It meant that Americans were trying to live, trade, travel, and argue under rules that the war was steadily breaking apart. For an American reader, the issue was not abstract. A British liner leaving New York could carry American citizens into waters that Germany had declared a war zone. If those Americans were harmed, what did neutrality mean? Did a warning in the newspapers shift responsibility onto the traveler? Did the nationality of the ship matter more than the nationality of the passengers? Could a belligerent power define a sea area as dangerous and then treat civilian passage through it as a military risk accepted in advance? These questions had no easy answer in the spring of 1915. They belonged to the larger crisis of modern war at sea. The submarine was not just a new weapon, it was a weapon that changed time. Older naval encounters involved signals, pursuit, boarding parties, prize crews, lifeboats, and delay. A torpedo compressed all of that into seconds. A commander, looking through a periscope, saw a hull, a course, a national identity, perhaps a silhouette and a target. The people inside the ship were real, but they were not visible in the same way they would be at a pier, on a deck, or in a lifeboat alongside. The German embassy warning brought that hidden reality to the surface before the voyage began. It told the public that passenger travel and war policy were now overlapping. It warned that the familiar Atlantic route to Liverpool passed into a zone where Germany claimed the right to act against British and Allied shipping. But even then, the full meaning of such a warning remained hard to absorb. People were used to danger at sea from storms, fog, collision, fire, and mechanical failure. They were less prepared to imagine one of the most famous liners in the world being struck by a submarine and sinking within minutes. That gap between knowledge and imagination is crucial. Passengers could know there was risk and still not picture the catastrophe that would come. They could read the warning and still trust Lusitania's speed. They could understand that war existed and still believe that a passenger liner would be treated differently from a naval vessel. They could hear that the waters around Britain were dangerous and still assume that danger would not take the form of sudden mass death. This was not simply foolishness. It was the weight of habit. The North Atlantic crossing had taught generations of travelers that immense ships, professional crews, and established companies could make the ocean manageable. Cunard's name carried authority. Lusitania's reputation carried authority. The very presence of tickets, sailing times, baggage handling, and embarkation procedures suggested that the voyage remained within the realm of ordinary life. War had entered the newspaper columns, but the pier still looked like a pier. The liner still looked like a liner. There was also a psychological distance between Europe's battlefield violence and New York's harbor. The Western Front, the armies, the trenches, and the destruction on the continent seemed far away from the routines of departure in an American port. The United States watched the European war from outside it, officially neutral, emotionally divided, and politically cautious. The warning in the newspapers compressed that distance. It suggested that the war could reach into a civilian itinerary and turn a scheduled crossing into a test of national rights. After the sinking, the existence of those warnings would be remembered again and again. They would be used to argue that the danger had been visible, They would also be used to show how openly Germany had announced a policy that many people considered intolerable. In memory, the warning became part of the moral complexity of the disaster. It did not soften the grief. It did not resolve the legal arguments. It did not prevent international outrage. Instead, it made the story more troubling because it showed that the catastrophe emerged not from ignorance alone, but from clashing assumptions about war, civilians, ships, and the sea. For the passengers preparing to sail, however, the warning was only one voice among many. Against it stood the confidence of the liner, the authority of the company, the long practice of Atlantic travel, and the belief that civilization still placed limits around civilian life. Those limits were exactly what the voyage would test. So, on the edge of May, the public warning and the private decision met at the waterfront. Newspapers had spoken. Germany had cautioned. The war zone had been declared. Still, Lusitania remained at New York, taking on passengers and crew for Liverpool under Captain William Thomas Turner. The old world had not yielded yet. It was about to cast off into the new one. At the waterfront, the warning became something more immediate than print. It became a choice made in public view, beneath the cranes and lines and funnels of New York Harbor. On May 1st, 1915, RMS Lusitania was no longer simply a subject of newspaper notices or diplomatic argument. She was a ship preparing to leave. Her destination was Liverpool, the familiar eastern end of the Cunard route that had defined so much of her career. Her commander was Captain William Thomas Turner, a Cunard officer taking one of the company's most famous liners back across the Atlantic. The voyage looked, in its outer form, like the continuation of an old routine. Passengers arriving with trunks and tickets, crew reporting to their stations, cargo and mail being handled, lines being made ready, a great British passenger ship turning toward the open sea. But by that morning, routine had become deceptive. The United States was still officially neutral. American cities were not blacked out. American ports were not being shelled. American families could still imagine the European war as something happening across an ocean, reported in columns of type, argued over in editorials, felt through trade and politics, but not yet accepted as America's war. That distance mattered. It allowed ordinary habits to continue, even while the world around those habits was changing. And one of those habits was travel. Americans still crossed the Atlantic. They still boarded British ships. They still had reasons to go to Europe. Family, business, duty, obligation, return journeys, private plans that war had complicated but not erased. The presence of American citizens aboard Lusitania was not an accident outside the logic of the age. It was part of the world that still existed in 1915, when neutrality did not mean isolation from the movement of people, money, cargo, mail, or news. The difficulty was that the Atlantic no longer meant the same thing to every power looking at it. To passengers at New York, Lusitania could appear as she had long appeared, a Cunard liner, a Royal Mail ship, a vessel of scale, machinery, service, and prestige. To Britain, she was part of a maritime system that connected the British Isles to the wider world. To Germany, operating under the War Zone Declaration around Britain, British and Allied shipping had become part of a battlefield at sea. The same hull could therefore carry different meanings at once. Passenger liner, British ship, mail steamer, symbol of empire, neutral traveler's conveyance, potential target. That contradiction traveled with her as surely as her passengers did. Captain Turner's command placed him at the center of those contradictions. He was not sailing a warship. He was taking a civilian liner across a route made famous by regular transatlantic passage. Yet he was also bringing a British vessel toward waters Germany had publicly declared dangerous. The old expectations of the sea had not vanished from the bridge, but neither could the war be kept off the chart. Lusitania's departure from New York therefore became a quiet act of transition. At the pier, she belonged to the visible world of liner travel. Gangways, whistles, smoke, ropes, harbor craft, watchers on shore. Once at sea, she would belong increasingly to a less visible world, distances, patrol areas, declared zones, and submarines that did not need to be seen in order to change the meaning of a voyage. This is part of what made the sailing so unsettling in retrospect. There was no single moment at New York when the old world clearly ended. No wall rose from the harbor. No sign over the Atlantic announced that civilian travel had entered a new moral and military landscape. Instead, the familiar forms continued. A liner sailed. People waved. The machinery turned. The route to Liverpool lay ahead as it had many times before. Yet the context had altered everything. Germany's warning notices had made clear that travelers sailing on British or Allied ships through the war zone did so under declared danger. The Cunard liner, leaving New York, was not doing so in ignorance of that danger. But knowledge did not produce a simple response. Some people regarded the warning as intimidation. Some trusted the ship's speed and the established rules of passenger travel. Some may have believed that even in war, a liner carrying civilians would not be attacked without warning and without a chance for evacuation. That belief had deep roots. It was connected to the older practice in which ships were stopped, searched, and dealt with under rules that assumed human beings aboard would be given some protection before destruction. Submarine warfare strained that assumption almost to breaking. But on May 1st, from the shore, that strain was not yet visible in its final form. Lusitania still had the mass and authority of a great liner. She was not a rumor or a policy. She was steel and decks and funnels and people. The fact that passengers continued to board tells us something important about how history is often lived. People do not make decisions with the clarity that later tragedy gives to events. They act inside uncertainty, inside habits, inside trust, inside incomplete information, and sometimes inside warnings they cannot fully measure. The United States, too, stood in that uncertain space. Neutrality was not simply a legal position. It was also a public mood, a political argument, and a fragile balance. President Woodrow Wilson's administration was trying to keep the country out of the European War, even as American rights and American lives became harder to separate from the conflict at sea. The Atlantic was the distance that made neutrality feel possible. But the Atlantic was also the place where neutrality could be tested most severely. Aboard a British liner, American citizens became part of that test. If they sailed safely, the old idea held that neutral Americans could travel, trade, and move through the world even while Europe fought. If they died because a belligerent power treated a passenger ship as a target inside a war zone, the meaning of neutrality would change. It would no longer be only a matter of policy written in Washington. It would become a question of graves, families, headlines, and national honor. None of this needed to be spoken aloud on the pier for it to be present. It was embedded in the voyage itself. The ship's route made the tension sharper. New York to Liverpool was not an obscure passage. It was one of the great arteries of the Atlantic world. Lusitania was not slipping quietly into a marginal sea. She was taking a known path between two major ports, a path bound up with mail, migration, commerce, and prestige. For decades, such routes had helped make the ocean feel organized. Timetables had turned distance into expectation. Liners had turned danger into service. Companies had sold not merely passage, but confidence. War threatened to reverse that achievement. It could make the scheduled route dangerous because it was scheduled. It could make fame hazardous because famous ships mattered. It could make size irrelevant because a submarine's weapon did not need to match a liner's scale. In the age of the great passenger ship, mass had seemed to promise safety. In the age of the torpedo, mass could become a target. Still, Lusitania sailed. As she moved down from New York and toward the Atlantic, she carried more than the people listed for the voyage. She carried the unresolved argument between civilian travel and total war. She carried the assumptions of passengers who believed, in different ways, that the sea still had rules. She carried the responsibility of a captain bringing a famous ship toward home. She carried the attention of a neutral country whose citizens were aboard a British vessel in wartime. And she carried a future that no one at the pier could yet fully see. For several days, the crossing would still resemble a crossing. The ocean was wide enough to create an illusion of separation. New York falling behind, Liverpool ahead, the war still concentrated in distant headlines and in the dangerous waters near the British Isles. But the decisive change had already occurred before Lusitania reached those waters. The passenger lane and the war zone had begun to overlap. That overlap is where the final voyage becomes more than a departure story. It becomes a measure of how quickly modern war could reach into civilian life without changing the outward shape of ordinary activity. A ticket could still be purchased. A gangway could still be crossed. A liner could still sail on schedule. Yet beneath those familiar actions, the rules of survival were being rewritten. Lusitania left New York as a passenger ship bound for Liverpool under Captain William Thomas Turner. She left from a neutral country whose citizens still believed they could move through the world without becoming combatants. She left after public warnings had appeared, but before those warnings had acquired the force of catastrophe. And she sailed toward waters where Germany's submarine war would no longer be an abstraction in print, but a presence beneath the surface. The ocean ahead did not announce itself as a battlefield. That was precisely the danger. The danger beneath the surface was not only a machine. It was a change in the rules. When Lusitania left New York, she carried with her the outward identity of the old Atlantic, a Cunard liner, a Royal Mail ship, a passenger vessel on a known route from New York to Liverpool. But the waters ahead had already been redefined by war. Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone, and that declaration changed the meaning of distance. The British Isles were no longer simply the end of a crossing. They were the edge of a contested space, watched, hunted, and argued over by nations that did not agree on what the sea still allowed. For generations, the destruction of a merchant ship had carried expectations that were almost ritual in their sequence. A vessel could be stopped. Its papers could be examined. Passengers and crew could be given a chance to leave. Only after that, under older prize rule practice, might a ship be destroyed. These customs did not make war gentle, but they did assume time, visibility, and a certain human pause between accusation and death. Submarine warfare strained that older world almost to the breaking point. A submarine did not enter the scene like a surface cruiser, with its flags visible and its guns in view. It survived by remaining unseen. Its power came from surprise, from the concealment of steel beneath the waterline, from the ability to strike before a target fully understood that it had been found. To require a submarine to surface, stop a vessel, permit evacuation, and remain nearby while lifeboats were launched was to ask it to surrender much of the very advantage that made it dangerous. That was the collision at the heart of the Lusitania story, before the torpedo was ever fired. It was not merely a question of one ship and one submarine. It was a confrontation between an inherited moral expectation and a new form of naval warfare. The passenger lane still carried civilians, mail, baggage, and assumptions about lawful travel. The war zone brought into that same lane a weapon designed for concealment and sudden attack. Germany's position had been made public before Lusitania sailed. Travelers had been warned that ships flying the flag of Britain or her allies were liable to destruction in the waters around the British Isles. The warning mattered because it showed that Germany was not treating the danger as rumor or accident. It was policy. Yet the warning did not settle the question for those who read it. A notice in a newspaper could say that a sea had become a war zone. It could not by itself persuade every traveler that a passenger liner carrying civilians across the Atlantic had become a legitimate target in the same way as a warship. That gap between legal argument and public imagination would become one of the defining spaces of the disaster. Germany could point to the declared war zone. Germany could argue that British vessels entering that zone did so under known risk. But passengers, families, and neutral observers could still ask a different question. Could modern war erase the old obligation to protect civilian life simply by naming the water dangerous? In 1915, that question was not theoretical. It was moving across the Atlantic with Lusitania. The ship herself belonged to the surface world. Her scale, her route, and her reputation had been built for visibility. She was meant to be seen at harbor entrances, printed in timetables, recognized in shipping columns, and remembered by passengers who had crossed on her. Her identity depended on confidence in schedules, in engineering, in the prestige of the Cunard line, in the idea that the Atlantic could be crossed by civilian travelers even while Europe was at war. The U-boat belonged to a different visual world. It was defined by absence. A submarine's presence might be known only in the moment when it was already too late. In that sense, submarine warfare did more than introduce a new weapon. It changed the psychology of the sea. Danger no longer had to appear on the horizon. It did not need smoke, masts, or a visible battle line. It could wait under a calm surface, invisible to those moving above it. This was why the war zone declaration around Britain mattered so deeply. It did not simply mark a region on a chart. It placed ordinary maritime movement inside a field of hidden threat. The passenger lane and the battlefield began to overlap. Ships still followed routes. Submarines searched the approaches to those routes. The geography of civilian travel became, from another point of view, the geography of naval opportunity. Lusitania's final voyage therefore moved through two systems at once. On paper and in memory, she was completing the familiar New York to Liverpool crossing. In the logic of the war at sea, she was approaching waters where Germany had announced that British and Allied shipping could be attacked. The same miles had two meanings. To passengers, they brought the ship closer to land, closer to mail delivery, business, family, and arrival. To the submarine war, they brought the ship closer to the declared danger zone around Britain. The older expectations did not vanish all at once. They continued to shape how people thought, even when they no longer governed events reliably. Many civilians still imagined that a great liner would be stopped before being destroyed, that lifeboats would be lowered, that human beings would be separated from the ship before the ship was sent under. Even anxiety often assumed a sequence. First warning, then time, then rescue. But a torpedo attack compressed everything. It replaced sequence with shock. That compression is central to understanding why Lusitania would have such force in public memory. The outrage that followed was not only about death, though the death toll would be devastating. It was also about the method. The submarine attack was carried out without Lusitania first being stopped and evacuated under older prize rule practice. To many observers, that fact made the disaster feel like a rupture in civilization itself. A passenger ship had not been challenged in the old manner. It had been struck. For Germany, the submarine campaign grew out of the realities of a war fought by empires and navies across trade routes. Britain depended on sea power. The waters around Britain were militarily important, but the more U-boat warfare pressed against commercial and passenger traffic, the more it blurred categories that civilians had relied upon. A ship might be large, elegant, and famous. It might carry passengers. It might sail a regular route. Yet in a declared war zone, those qualities did not guarantee safety. This was the frightening new arithmetic of the sea. The liner was built to move quickly across the ocean. The submarine was built to wait beneath it. The liner represented mass movement and public travel. The submarine represented secrecy and concentrated violence. When those two worlds met, there might be no formal encounter, no negotiation, no visible warning at the rail. There might only be the sudden arrival of a torpedo against steel. The submarine that would enter Lusitania's story was German U-boat U-20. Its name has become inseparable from the disaster, but before the moment of attack, it was part of the larger submarine war pressing around the British Isles. U-20 was not a symbol to those aboard Lusitania as the ship crossed the Atlantic. It was not a visible threat moving across the water like a storm. It was a hidden instrument of a policy already announced to the world: German submarine warfare in waters declared dangerous around Britain. That is what gives the final approach its particular dread. Lusitania was not sailing into an unknown war in the broad sense. The warnings had been printed. The war zone had been declared. The debate over danger had already begun in newspapers, embassies, and private conversations. But knowledge of danger is not the same as seeing it. A passenger standing aboard a liner could look out across the sea and see water, sky, and the ordinary signs of passage. The new war did not have to show itself until the instant it acted. As Lusitania neared the British Isles, the old Atlantic and the new war drew close together. The ship was still bound for Liverpool, still moving toward the end of a transatlantic route that had carried generations of travelers. Yet off the southern coast of Ireland, near the approaches to home waters, the declared war zone was no longer an idea printed in American newspapers. It was a physical reality beneath the ship's path. There, in the waters off Ireland, German U-20 would encounter Lusitania. The passenger lane, the war zone declaration, the fading power of older prize rule expectations, and the hidden logic of the submarine would all converge near the southern coast, close to land and close to the end of the crossing. For those aboard, the voyage was approaching Britain. For history, it was approaching the old head of Kinsale. By the time Lusitania came into the waters off southern Ireland, the Atlantic crossing was nearly behind her. The ship had left New York on May 1, 1915. bound for Liverpool under Captain William Thomas Turner, and now, on May 7th, the long west-to-east passage was closing into the familiar approaches to the British Isles. For passengers and crew, this was the part of the voyage when distance began to feel smaller. The ocean was no longer an endless field between continents. It was becoming a route with a destination, a coast, a harbor ahead, and the expectation of arrival. That nearness is part of what makes the disaster so difficult to hold in proportion. Lusitania was not lost in the empty middle of the Atlantic, far from all landmarks and rescue. She was torpedoed off the southern coast of Ireland, near the old head of Kinsale, close enough to land for the place itself to become inseparable from the memory of the sinking. The name would later carry the weight of geography and tragedy together. The Old Head, a headland on the Irish coast, standing near the maritime approaches through which a liner from America would pass on the final leg toward Liverpool. For a ship like Lusitania, this coast was not exotic or strange. It belonged to the geography of transatlantic travel. The route from New York to Liverpool was one of the great corridors of the Ocean Age, linking the commercial and human life of the United States with Britain. Passengers crossed for business, family, service, obligation, and personal reasons. Mail crossed with them. Cargo crossed with them. News crossed with them. A Cunard liner did not simply move individuals over water. It held together a system of movement that had become ordinary because it was repeated so often. But in May of 1915, ordinary routes had acquired a second meaning. The same waters that formed the final approach to Britain also lay within the danger Germany had announced. The war zone declaration around Britain had transformed the approaches to the British Isles into a place where civilian travel and naval war could meet without warning. What had once been a passenger lane had become, in practice, a contested space. That transformation did not necessarily announce itself to the senses. A person standing aboard a liner might see sea and sky, funnels and rigging, the ordered life of a great ship still carrying itself with the authority of peacetime engineering. The routines of shipboard life could continue almost until the moment they did not. Meals, conversations, reading, deck walking, duties below, navigation above, all of it could preserve the impression that the old world was still functioning. The ship was still Lusitania, still a Royal Mail ship of the Cunard Line, still one of the famous liners of the North Atlantic. Yet the war had changed what could be hidden. A surface raider could be seen. A warship could signal. A ship stopped under older expectations could be searched, and people might imagine time for lifeboats, transfer, negotiation, or warning. The submarine altered that sequence. Its power lay partly in the fact that it did not have to resemble the dangers people expected. U-20 did not need to appear on the horizon as a visible adversary. It could wade below the surface, making the sea itself uncertain. Near the old head of Kinsale, two forms of time overlapped. There was the time of the voyage, days at sea, the steady progress from New York, the narrowing distance to Liverpool. And there was the time of war, the moment of decision compressed into an unseen submarine encounter. The first kind of time encouraged anticipation. The second allowed almost no preparation at all. For passengers who had read the German embassy warnings before sailing, the danger had already been stated in public language. Travelers on British or Allied ships had been cautioned about the risks of passing through the war zone. But warnings in newspapers are experienced differently from danger at sea. In New York, the warning was printed among other notices and reports. It was a fact to consider, to doubt, to weigh against habit, confidence, necessity, and the long-standing belief that passenger liners occupied a different moral category from warships. Off Ireland, the warning was no longer an argument. It was the condition of the water around them. The closeness to Britain sharpened the cruel contrast. The end of an Atlantic crossing is supposed to narrow uncertainty. A ship has survived the open ocean. The route has carried it across the broadest part of its journey. Land is no longer an abstraction on a chart, but a real presence somewhere beyond the horizon or along the coast. In another age, or under another set of rules, that nearness might have felt like safety, increasing with every mile. Instead, Lusitania had entered the zone where the final approach was also the most dangerous. The southern coast of Ireland was part of the gateway to Britain, and therefore part of the war's maritime perimeter. Liverpool was still the destination, but the road to Liverpool ran through waters where Germany's submarine campaign had made no simple distinction between the prestige of a liner and the vulnerability of a target. This was the collision at the heart of the Lusitania story. Not simply ship against submarine, but expectation against method. Lusitania represented scale, speed, and public confidence. U-20 represented concealment, asymmetry, and a new kind of naval reach. The ship's passengers had crossed most of an ocean inside a vessel that symbolized the triumph of industrial maritime travel. The submarine waiting in those waters belonged to a war in which industrial power had also learned to strike from invisibility. Captain William Thomas Turner and his ship were nearing the British Isles under conditions shaped by decisions far beyond the bridge: German policy, British wartime status, transatlantic commerce, American neutrality, and the unresolved question of how civilian lives would be treated in a sea war. These large forces did not remain in chancelleries or newspaper columns. They gathered at a specific place, on a specific date, off a specific coast. That is why the location matters. Near the old head of Kinsale is not just a navigational marker in the story. It tells us how close the liner was to completing the voyage. It tells us that the disaster happened not in some remote blankness, but in the approaches to a known destination. It places the event in sight of the British Isles, at the edge of home waters, where a ship from New York should have been entering the final chapter of its crossing. The people aboard could not see the full historical shape of the moment. They could not know that the name of their ship would soon become one of the most powerful symbols in the argument over submarine warfare. They could not know that the deaths of American citizens aboard would travel back across the Atlantic as shock, outrage, and diplomatic crisis. They could not know that the United States would not enter the war immediately, but that this day would help move American opinion and policy toward a darker horizon. What they had, instead, was the present tense of a voyage nearing its end. A British Cunard liner bound for Liverpool, a declared war zone around Britain, a German submarine in the same waters, the southern coast of Ireland close by, the old head of Kinsale giving the scene its enduring name. Then the hidden war reached the passenger lane. U-20's encounter with Lusitania was no longer a possibility beneath the surface. It was about to become an act, a torpedo fired into the starboard side of a ship that was almost home. The act itself came from beneath the surface, from a weapon designed to make distance collapse. Lusitania was close to the southern coast of Ireland, near the old head of Kinsale, when German U-20 brought the war zone declaration into physical form. The passenger liner that had left New York for Liverpool was no longer being judged only by diplomats, newspapers, or warnings printed before departure. In that moment, she was being judged by a submarine commander through the logic of war at sea. The torpedo struck Lusitania on the starboard side. For those aboard, the first sensation was not an argument. It was a shock through steel. A great ship has its own internal world: decks, corridors, dining rooms, cabins, engine spaces, cargo spaces, lifeboat stations, stairways, and human routines layered one above another. When the torpedo hit, that world was violently interrupted. The impact was localized in one sense, because the weapon entered one side of the hull, but in another sense it was total, because the meaning of the ship changed instantly. Lusitania was no longer a liner approaching Liverpool. She was a wounded vessel inside a war zone. The strike also marked the collapse of an older expectation. Before submarine warfare reshaped the Atlantic approaches, many people still imagined that ships, especially passenger ships, belonged to a category that required warning, stopping, searching, and evacuation before destruction. That expectation had already been challenged by Germany's declared war zone around Britain. But the torpedo made the challenge irreversible. U-20 did not stop Lusitania and allow passengers and crew to disembark before the attack. The ship was struck while carrying civilians across a route that had once symbolized prestige, speed, and regular Atlantic connection. Then came the detail that has remained one of the most disputed and haunting parts of the disaster. After the torpedo, witnesses and later accounts described a second explosion. It is important to linger over that sentence carefully. A second explosion was reported. Its exact cause has never been settled in a way that ends the argument. The event mattered not only because of what people heard or felt in the moment, but because it shaped how the sinking was remembered, investigated, defended, and challenged. If the torpedo was the known act, the second explosion became the mystery that followed it. Some accounts described it as larger than the first. Others treated it as different in character. The language has varied because people experienced disaster from different places aboard the ship, and because memory under sudden danger is never a laboratory instrument. A passenger on one deck, a crewman in a working space, and someone looking from outside the vessel might all describe the same sequence differently. What can be said with confidence is that the torpedo struck the starboard side, and that a second explosion was described soon afterward in witness testimony and later retellings. The proposed explanations have ranged across the ship's own machinery, fuel, structure, and cargo. One possibility, often discussed, is steam. Lusitania was a large, steam-powered liner, part of an engineering age that relied on boilers, turbines, and the controlled violence of heat and pressure. Her identity as a fast Cunard vessel was tied to immense mechanical power. In that kind of ship, a torpedo did not merely open a hole in a wall. It struck near systems whose normal operation depended on pressure, pipes, metal, and heat. A rupture connected to steam or machinery has therefore been one explanation offered for the second blast, or for what witnesses understood as one. Coal has also been proposed. Coal was not an incidental detail in ships of this era. It was the stored energy that allowed a vessel like Lusitania to cross the Atlantic at speed. Coal dust, coal bunkers, and the disturbance of fuel spaces have all figured in attempts to explain how a second explosive event might have followed the torpedo. This does not require turning the ship into a secret bomb. It requires remembering that a liner was also an industrial environment, carrying the materials and mechanisms that made ocean travel possible. Another explanation has focused on structural failure. A torpedo strike could damage compartments, bulkheads, plating, and internal supports in ways that produce sounds and shocks difficult for witnesses to distinguish from a separate detonation. A vast steel hull under stress could fail violently. Water entering fast, pressure changing, machinery spaces disrupted, and the ship's frame absorbing the force of the blow could all create events that sounded, to those living through them, like explosions. In a disaster that unfolded in minutes, the boundary between blast, rupture, collapse, and machinery failure could be impossible to separate by ear. And then there is the cargo question, the most politically charged of all. Germany argued that Lusitania was a British ship traveling through a declared war zone and carrying ammunition or war materiel. Sources agree that ammunition or war materiel was aboard. That fact is central to the controversy, and it cannot be erased from the history. But it also cannot be allowed to do more work than the evidence securely permits. The exact role of that cargo in the rapid sinking remains debated. To say that war material was aboard is not the same as proving that it caused the second explosion, or that it was the decisive reason the ship went down so quickly. This distinction matters because Lusitania's sinking became, almost immediately, more than a question of naval mechanics. It became an argument over legitimacy. For Germany, the presence of war material supported the claim that the ship was not simply an innocent passenger carrier, but part of the Allied war supply system moving through a declared danger zone. For Britain, the United States, and many outraged observers, the central fact remained the destruction of a passenger liner without first stopping and evacuating the civilians aboard. The second explosion sat between these arguments, useful to those who wanted proof of hidden danger, but resistant to final certainty. The danger for history is to turn uncertainty into drama too easily. The second explosion invites that temptation. It offers a hidden chamber in the story, a moment where people search for a single secret that explains everything: why the ship sank so fast, why so many died, why the diplomatic shock became so severe. But disasters at sea rarely submit to one clean explanation. They are usually the result of several conditions converging. A torpedo, a great ship's internal systems, the placement of damage, water entering, loss of stability, human confusion, lifeboats, list, time, and fear. Cargo, perhaps, but not as a simple answer beyond dispute. The careful version of the story is also the more unsettling one. A famous liner did not need to be transformed into a myth in order to be vulnerable. Lusitania was already vulnerable because she was a passenger ship in waters that had been declared a war zone, because a submarine could strike without presenting itself as a surface warship, and because the weapon arrived before most people aboard could even understand what was happening. The second explosion deepened the shock, but the first torpedo had already changed the fate of the voyage. Inside the ship, the sequence would have been experienced not as a courtroom debate, but as acceleration. The first impact, then the second explosion or violent event, then the realization that the vessel was not merely damaged, but in grave danger. A ship of Lusitania's size carried an aura of permanence. Her length, her speed, her history on the Atlantic, her identity as a Royal Mail ship of the Cunard line, all suggested endurance. But steel prestige does not guarantee time. Once the hull was opened and the ship's systems were thrown into crisis, the liner's scale became part of the terror. There were many people to move, many decks to cross, many lifeboats to manage, many decisions to make, and very little time in which to make them. That is why the second explosion remains so central to the memory of May 7, 1915. It appears at the hinge between attack and catastrophe. Before it, one can still imagine a wounded ship, perhaps damaged but not doomed. After it, in the recollections of many, the disaster seemed to take on a different force. Whether caused by steam, coal, structural failure, cargo-related factors, or some combination that still resists final agreement, the reported second explosion became part of the explanation for why events moved so quickly. Yet the most important fact is not that the debate exists. It is what the debate points toward. The sinking did not unfold over hours, with rescue procedures gradually overtaking danger. It compressed disaster into a span so brief that normal maritime order could scarcely function. The torpedo and the second explosion were followed by a race against time that the ship, the crew, and the passengers could not control. Lusitania had crossed the Atlantic from New York and had nearly reached the familiar approaches to Liverpool. She had passed from the world of warnings into the world of impact. On her starboard side, the sea had been opened into the ship. Within her hull, something more had been heard, felt, and remembered as a second explosion. Around her, the Irish coast was close, but not close enough to prevent what followed. The question now was no longer whether a passenger liner could be attacked in a declared war zone. That had been answered in a single strike. The question was how quickly a floating city, built for speed and confidence, could disappear once modern war found its way inside. The answer would shock the world, because it came not in hours, but in minutes. The answer came with terrifying speed. After the torpedo struck Lusitania's starboard side, and after witnesses remembered the second, deeper violence that followed, the disaster entered a different kind of time. Not the measured time of an Atlantic crossing. Not the clockwork time of a liner's schedule from New York to Liverpool. This was compression, a great ship losing the future minute by minute, while those aboard tried to understand what had happened quickly enough to survive it. Lusitania did not sink after a long night of damage control. She did not remain afloat for hours while rescue vessels gathered around her. The commonly cited time from torpedo strike to sinking is about 18 minutes. Some accounts describe it more broadly as within 20 minutes. Either way, the meaning is the same. A ship associated with power, speed, and imperial confidence disappeared in less time than many passengers would have needed simply to find family members, reach the boat deck, understand orders, and get clear of the hull. That was part of the shock. Lusitania was not an obscure vessel lost in a remote sea. She was a Royal Mail ship of the Cunard line, a name known on the North Atlantic. She belonged to the world of schedules, tickets, dining rooms, deck chairs, turbine power, and fast passage between great ports. She had been launched in June of 1906 and had entered service in 1907, a product of the era when ocean liners were among the most visible machines on Earth. At roughly 787 feet long, and with a tonnage often cited around 31,550 tons, she represented scale in a form that ordinary people could board. Yet, scale did not save her. In fact, scale may have made the disaster harder for the mind to accept. A small craft could be imagined as fragile. A vast liner seemed almost like infrastructure, a moving piece of civilization. Passengers did not merely board a ship, they entered a system. There were officers and stewards, engineers and wireless operators, lifeboats and routines, corridors and stairways, cabins and public rooms. The ship was supposed to contain danger, to organize it, to make the ocean manageable. But the strike changed that organization into confusion. The torpedo had opened the ship on the starboard side and whatever followed inside the hull worsened the sense of immediate catastrophe. Lusitania began to settle and list. In such a short interval, every ordinary action became difficult. A corridor that had been familiar a few minutes earlier could become a climb. A deck that had seemed level could tilt underfoot. Passengers had to move through a ship that was no longer behaving like a ship in service, but like a damaged structure shifting beneath them. Escape at sea depends on time. It depends on warning, muster, clear passageways, working equipment, and the ability to lower boats into water with some measure of control. Lusitania's passengers and crew had almost none of the time that a disaster plan quietly assumes. There were families aboard. There were travelers who had crossed the Atlantic in confidence, despite the German warning notices that had appeared before the voyage. There were crew members suddenly asked to turn training and discipline into action under conditions changing faster than human systems could easily absorb. The older expectation that a vessel might be stopped and evacuated before destruction had already been bypassed. That mattered not only legally or diplomatically, but physically. If a ship is halted, searched, and given time to put people into boats, disaster unfolds in one pattern. If a torpedo detonates against the hull without prior evacuation, disaster unfolds in another. Lusitania's sinking revealed the human consequence of that change. The submarine did not merely alter naval warfare. It altered the amount of time civilians had between danger and death. The rapid loss also gave the sinking its lasting cinematic power, though the reality was not cinematic in the comforting sense. It was not orderly. It was not slow enough for every choice to be made. Lifeboats had to be readied while the ship was listing. People had to decide whether to wait for instructions, search for loved ones, climb toward open decks, or trust that help would come. The Irish coast was near, but near is not the same as reachable. The old head of Kinsale gave the disaster a geographical name, a fixed point on a map. Yet for those in the water, the distance between ship and shore was still an oceanic distance. In the public imagination, the most stunning fact became the brevity. About 18 minutes. Within 20 minutes. These phrases circulated because they reduced the entire catastrophe to a measure anyone could feel. 18 minutes is not an afternoon. It is not even a full hour. It is a fragment of time. It is the length of a short walk, a meal barely begun, a conversation interrupted. To imagine a liner of Lusitania's size vanishing in that span was to confront a new scale of vulnerability. This was why the loss could not be treated as just another wartime sinking. The ship had embodied the confidence of transatlantic travel. Its speed had once been a source of prestige, part of the Cunard identity and the broader competition of Atlantic liners. Speed suggested mastery, the ability to narrow the ocean, to bind Liverpool and New York into a dependable route. But on May 7, 1915, speed belonged to the collapse itself. The famous liner did not outpace danger. Once struck, she moved with terrible rapidity toward the bottom. There is an important restraint in how the sinking must be understood. The second explosion remained a matter of debate, with proposed causes including steam, coal, structural failure, and cargo-related possibilities. Sources agree that ammunition or war material was aboard, and Germany would make that part of its argument. But the exact role of that cargo in the rapid sinking remains disputed. What is not disputed is the effect visible to the world. A passenger liner carrying civilians, crossing a declared war zone, had been torpedoed by U-20 and had gone down with extraordinary speed. The brevity also shaped responsibility in the public mind. If the ship had remained afloat for many hours, debate might still have been fierce, but the human story would have looked different. There would have been more time for boats, more time for nearby aid, more time for separation between the act of attack and the final drowning. Instead, the violence and the loss seemed almost fused. The torpedo, the second explosion, the list, the struggle for boats, the plunge into the water, and the disappearance of the ship all belonged to the same brief sequence. For survivors, memory would be marked by acceleration. One moment, Lusitania was still the liner that had left New York under Captain William Thomas Turner, approaching the British Isles at the end of a transatlantic voyage. Minutes later, she was no longer a ship that could carry anyone to Liverpool. That transformation is difficult to overstate. A vessel is a promise of arrival. In those final minutes, that promise broke apart. For observers on land, for newspaper readers in Britain and the United States, and for officials who would soon write protests and defenses, the speed of the sinking gave the event its symbolic force. Modern war had not only killed civilians, it had done so before the old moral imagination could catch up. The assumptions attached to passenger liners, neutral travelers, and evacuation at sea were overwhelmed by the mechanics of submarine attack. In about 18 minutes, Lusitania passed from prestige to wreck, from known Atlantic liner to international crisis, from a ship nearing home to a mass casualty disaster off the southern coast of Ireland. The shortness of that interval is part of why the world remembered her. It made the loss feel both enormous and intimate. Enormous because of the ship's scale and reputation, intimate because every life aboard was forced into the same shrinking measure of time. And when the sea closed over Lusitania, the clock stopped for the ship, but not for the consequences. What remained were names, nationalities, families, and numbers that would be counted with anguish and argued over with precision. The speed of the sinking had stunned the world. The human toll would give that shock its full weight. When the clock stopped for Lusitania, the counting began. At first, there was confusion, as there almost always is after catastrophe at sea. A ship had vanished quickly, close enough to land for the Irish coast to become part of the story, but still far enough from safety that rescue could not undo the scale of the loss. Boats, wreckage, survivors, and bodies became the evidence of what had happened. The great liner's final minutes were over. The work of naming the dead had only begun. The toll has never belonged to a single, perfectly settled number in public memory. Different institutions and historical summaries give small variations. The Library of Congress has described the loss as at least 1,191 dead. Other accounts often give 1,198. In broader remembrance, the figure is frequently rounded to roughly 1,200. The variation is small beside the magnitude, but it matters because it reminds us that this disaster was not only measured in headlines. It was measured in lists, passenger manifests, crew records, recovered remains, missing persons, and families waiting for certainty. Those numbers included passengers and crew. They included people who had crossed the Atlantic in the ordinary expectation that a liner, even in wartime, was still a passenger ship. They included those who had boarded in New York on May 1, 1915, bound for Liverpool, trusting speed, habit, and the long culture of ocean travel. They included members of the ship's working world as well as its traveling world, people for whom Lusitania was not a glamorous machine seen from the pier, but a place of labor, duty, routine, and livelihood. This is one of the reasons the loss cut so deeply. Lusitania was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It carried civilians through a declared war zone, and that fact was central to the controversy. Germany had warned that British and Allied ships in the waters around Britain were at risk. Germany would later argue that Lusitania was a British ship, that the war zone had been declared, and that the ship carried war materiel. But the people who died were not abstractions within that argument. They were human beings caught in a new form of naval war, where a submarine could strike without the older practice of stopping a vessel and allowing evacuation before destruction. The dead were counted by nationality, by class of passage, by job aboard ship, by family connection, by whether they had been found or remained missing. Each category served a purpose, but each also reduced something larger. A passenger list could identify a name, but not the last thought of the person who carried it. A nationality could shape diplomatic response, but not contain grief. A total could tell the world that nearly 1,200 people had been lost, but not show the full human shape of a ship filled with separate lives. Among the dead were approximately 128 American citizens. That figure gave the disaster a direct force in the United States, which was still officially neutral in the European War. Before Lusitania sank, Americans could read about the war as a terrible conflict across the Atlantic. They could argue about neutrality, trade, the rights of passengers, and the dangers of traveling on British ships. They could see the German embassy's warnings in newspapers and decide whether those warnings were serious, lawful, intimidating, or irrelevant. But after May 7, 1915, the war had killed Americans aboard a famous liner. That changed the emotional geography of the conflict. The United States was not pulled into war immediately. That distinction is important. President Woodrow Wilson did not ask Congress for a declaration of war in 1915. His administration protested to Germany and demanded protection for American lives. The road to American entry would continue for nearly 2 more years, shaped by renewed, unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, and a wider breakdown in relations with Germany. But Lusitania made neutrality feel less distant. It made the submarine war personal to American households and politically urgent in Washington. The American dead mattered not because their lives were worth more than the British, Irish, Canadian, or other lives lost, but because their deaths crossed the boundary of neutrality. They created a question that no American administration could easily avoid. What did it mean for citizens of a neutral country to be killed while traveling on a passenger liner? Could Germany declare waters around Britain a war zone and, by doing so, shift the risk onto travelers? Could a civilian ship be treated as a target because it was British, because it was in wartime waters, or because it carried war-related cargo? And if Americans died under those conditions, what responsibility did the United States have to respond? These were not merely legal questions. They were questions of public feeling. American newspapers gave the disaster massive attention, and early reports did not immediately settle the full scale of the loss. As the numbers hardened, outrage hardened with them. The figure of approximately 128 Americans became a repeated measure of injury. It was not the whole tragedy, but it was the part that gave the tragedy a direct American claim. In Britain, the loss had its own force. Lusitania was a Cunard liner, a British vessel, part of a maritime culture that had helped define imperial connection and transatlantic movement. The sinking was not just the destruction of a ship. It was an attack on a visible symbol of civilian passage and national prestige. But even that language can make the event sound too distant. For the people waiting in Liverpool, in New York, and elsewhere, the first reality was not symbolism. It was absence. A ship expected to arrive did not arrive. People expected at home did not come home. The small variations in the death toll also reveal something about disaster itself. Precision becomes an act of respect, but it is hard won. Some sources say at least 1,191. Others say 1,198. Many accounts say about 1,200, because the exact figure, though important, does not change the essential truth. The sinking of Lusitania was one of the great civilian maritime losses of the First World War era. It was a mass death event compressed into minutes, with consequences that continued for years. The speed of the sinking made the casualty count especially haunting. Had Lusitania remained afloat longer, more boats might have been launched, more people might have escaped, and the disaster might have entered history differently. But the ship went down in about 18 minutes, sometimes described as within 20 minutes. That short interval left little room for orderly survival. It turned confusion into fate with terrible speed. The toll was not simply the result of a torpedo strike. It was the result of a rapid, cascading loss of ship, time, and usable options. This is why the numbers cannot be separated from the mechanics of the sinking. A great liner, built for speed and confidence, became a trap because it died too quickly. The starboard impact, the reported second explosion, the list, the lowering of boats under extreme conditions, the nearness of land that was still not rescue enough, all of it shaped who lived and who did not. The death toll was the human expression of those physical facts. And then, once the bodies and names became public, the disaster moved from the sea into politics. The deaths aboard Lusitania gave the sinking its moral charge. They made Germany's submarine campaign a subject not only of military calculation, but of civilian vulnerability. They made Americans ask whether the Atlantic was still a space where neutral citizens could travel with some expectation of protection. They made Britain present the sinking as evidence of German ruthlessness. They forced Germany to defend an act that had killed nearly 1,200 people, including approximately 128 from a country not yet at war. The ship itself was gone. Its passengers and crew could not be restored by protest, inquiry, diplomacy, or propaganda. But the meaning of their deaths was immediately contested. In that contest, the human toll became the center of the story. Without the dead, Lusitania would have been a naval incident involving a British vessel in a declared war zone. With them, it became something much larger, a disaster that turned submarine warfare into a public moral crisis. The sea had taken the ship in minutes. The lists of the dead carried the shock outward, across Britain, across the Atlantic, and into the neutral United States. Grief became anger. Anger became argument. And as the names were printed, mourned, and repeated, Lusitania began to change from a lost liner into a symbol powerful enough to trouble governments on both sides of the ocean. The lists of the dead did not stay still. They moved through newspapers, across telegraph lines, into homes, clubs, churches, government offices, and editorial rooms. What had happened off the southern coast of Ireland near the old head of Kinsale was no longer only a maritime loss. It was becoming a public event on both sides of the Atlantic, shaped by grief, anger, patriotism, and the terrible clarity of civilian names. In Britain, the shock was immediate because Lusitania was not an obscure vessel. It was a Cunard liner, a Royal Mail ship, a familiar name in the great transatlantic passenger trade. It belonged to the route between Liverpool and New York, to the world of schedules, saloons, luggage, stewards, letters, and arrivals. Its destruction was therefore felt not simply as the loss of a ship, but as an attack on a recognizable civilian space. The British public already lived inside war. By May of 1915, Britain had endured months of conflict, casualty lists from the land war, and anxiety over the sea lanes that connected the island to the wider world. But the sinking of Lusitania gave that anxiety a human image almost too powerful to absorb. A passenger liner had been torpedoed without being stopped and evacuated under older prize rule expectations. It had gone down in about 18 minutes. Among the dead were women, children, crew members, travelers, and citizens of a neutral power. For many in Britain, the conclusion was immediate. Germany's submarine campaign had crossed a moral boundary. The war at sea was no longer imagined only in terms of blockades, cruisers, cargoes, and naval strategy. It was now discussed through the vulnerability of ordinary passengers aboard a liner. The ship became a symbol of civilian exposure in an age when modern weapons could strike without warning from beneath the surface. That symbolism mattered. The submarine was not new as a machine, but in this war, it was becoming new as a political instrument. U-boats could challenge British sea power in ways that surface raiders could not. They could appear briefly, fire, and vanish. To Germany, this offered a weapon against Britain's maritime strength and the flow of goods into British ports. To Britain and many observers in neutral countries, it seemed to dissolve older distinctions between combatant and non-combatant, between the warship and the passenger liner, between military necessity and murder at sea. The anger was not only official. It was emotional and visual. Newspapers gave the disaster enormous attention. Reports of the sinking, survivors, missing passengers, and the scale of death helped turn Lusitania into a name that could be spoken almost as shorthand for German brutality. In the first rush of news, as the Library of Congress has noted in its exhibition context, early headlines could underestimate the loss of life. That confusion did not soften the reaction. If anything, the movement from uncertainty to a fuller casualty count deepened the shock. The story became worse as it became clearer. In the United States, the reaction was more complicated because the country was still officially neutral. Americans had watched the European war from a distance, though not from isolation. American citizens traveled, traded, argued, and read daily news from the battlefields and sea lanes. Lusitania forced that distant war into American homes with a new immediacy. Approximately 128 American citizens had died aboard a British ship on a voyage from New York to Liverpool. That fact gave the disaster a special force. The dead were not only foreign civilians caught in a European conflict. They were Americans killed while the United States was not at war with Germany. Their presence aboard Lusitania turned submarine warfare into a question of neutral rights, passenger safety, and freedom of the seas. Could a neutral citizen travel on a British passenger liner through a declared war zone and expect some measure of protection? Could Germany's warning notices in American newspapers shift responsibility onto passengers who chose to sail? Could a belligerent nation treat a liner as a legitimate target if it believed the ship carried war materiel? These questions did not produce one simple American answer. Some Americans were already sympathetic to Britain and France. For them, The sinking confirmed their belief that Germany represented a dangerous and lawless power. Others were committed to neutrality and feared that public anger might pull the United States into a European war. Still others looked at trade, travel, and diplomacy and saw how difficult neutrality had become when American lives and commerce moved through waters declared dangerous by a belligerent. But even where Americans disagreed over policy, the emotional effect was unmistakable. Anti-German feeling intensified. Editorial voices condemned the attack. Public discussion turned again and again to the idea that civilian passengers had been placed in the path of a weapon that gave them almost no chance. The speed of the sinking mattered here. Had the ship been stopped, searched, and evacuated, the controversy would have been different. Instead, Lusitania was struck by U-20 off Ireland and disappeared with astonishing speed. The method of destruction became part of the outrage. This was the moral heart of the reaction. Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone. It had warned travelers. It would argue that Lusitania was a British vessel and that the ship carried ammunition or war material. Those points would become central to the diplomatic and propaganda battle. But in the first wave of public grief and anger, the dominant image was not a legal brief. It was a great passenger liner, crowded with civilians, going down in minutes. The contrast between warning and responsibility became one of the central tensions. The German embassy's notices had appeared in American newspapers before Lusitania sailed. They cautioned that vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or its allies were liable to destruction in the war zone around Britain, and that travelers sailed at their own risk. After the sinking, German defenders could point to those warnings and say that danger had been publicly declared. Yet warnings did not settle the moral question. To many Americans and Britons, a notice printed before departure could not transform civilian passengers into acceptable casualties. A warning might explain that Germany had announced its policy. It did not make that policy legitimate in the eyes of those who believed passenger ships occupied a different category from warships. This is why Lusitania became more than an argument about who had been told what. It became an argument about what war was allowed to become. In Britain, the sinking quickly became a powerful propaganda subject. The government and press could use Lusitania to emphasize civilian victimhood and German ruthlessness. Posters, newspaper coverage, and later imagery surrounding the disaster helped fix the event in public memory. The ship's name carried emotional force because it joined scale and intimacy. A famous liner, nearly 1,200 dead, families broken, Americans among them, and a weapon that seemed to strike from nowhere. In the United States, that symbolism worked differently, but no less powerfully. It did not bring immediate war. President Woodrow Wilson's administration would protest to Germany rather than ask Congress for a declaration in 1915. That distinction is essential. Lusitania did not single-handedly take America into the First World War. The United States would not declare war on Germany until April of 1917, after a broader crisis that included renewed, unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. But the sinking changed the emotional and diplomatic ground. It made Germany's submarine policy a public issue in the United States in a way that abstract warnings had not. It gave American neutrality a human cost. It forced Wilson's government to defend the principle that American lives could not simply be placed outside protection because they had traveled on a belligerent ship. And it made future submarine attacks harder to treat as isolated incidents. That is how public outrage can alter history without producing immediate war. It changes what governments must answer for. It changes the language available to newspapers, politicians, diplomats, and ordinary citizens. Before Lusitania, submarine warfare could be described as a harsh military development in a vast European war. After Lusitania, it carried the image of passengers trapped on a sinking liner, of lifeboats made useless by speed and list, of neutral citizens dead before their government had entered the conflict. The outrage also exposed a deeper collision between technology and law. Older maritime expectations had imagined a sequence: a ship challenged, stopped, searched, and if necessary, destroyed after its crew and passengers had been given a chance to survive. Submarine warfare under war zone conditions often made that sequence difficult or impossible. A U-boat that surfaced to warn a ship could become vulnerable. A passenger liner, especially a large and fast one, was not easily handled, as though the ocean were still governed by 19th century habits. Yet the practical difficulties of submarine warfare did not erase the moral demand. That demand came through sharply in public reaction. If a method of war required the sudden killing of civilians, then the method itself had to be judged. Military necessity was not enough. The sinking of Lusitania forced submarine warfare into the court of world opinion, where strategy had to answer to grief. Across the Atlantic, then, the disaster became a shared argument with different accents. In Britain, it hardened the picture of Germany as an enemy willing to attack civilians at sea. In the United States, it stirred anger while also intensifying the debate over neutrality, rights, and the danger of being drawn into war. In both places, Lusitania became a symbol of civilian vulnerability and modern conflict. But symbols are never uncontested for long. As Britain and the United States mourned and condemned, Germany insisted that the story had another side, a British ship sailing through a declared war zone, carrying war material, after published warnings had told passengers of the danger. The moral outrage over the dead was real, but so was the controversy over the ship's status and cargo. From the first days after the sinking, those claims began to shape the next battle over Lusitania's meaning. The argument over Lusitania did not begin after the mourning ended. It began almost at once, while bodies were still being recovered, while survivors were still giving accounts, and while newspapers were still trying to understand how a famous liner could disappear so quickly. Britain and many Americans saw the attack as the killing of civilians without warning. Germany answered with a different frame. Lusitania was not an innocent vessel moving outside the war, but a British ship entering waters Germany had declared a war zone after public warnings had been printed, and with war material aboard. That defense mattered because it tried to shift the question. If the disaster was seen only as a passenger liner destroyed with men, women, and children aboard, Germany stood before world opinion as the author of a moral outrage. But if the ship could be presented as part of Britain's war system, then the sinking could be argued as an act of war inside a war zone. Germany's claim did not make the deaths less real. It did not soften the image of people trapped on a sinking liner off the southern coast of Ireland, but it did create the controversy that has followed Lusitania ever since. The first part of Germany's argument was the simplest. Lusitania was British. It belonged to the Cunard line. It was sailing to Liverpool. It was not an American ship, even though American citizens were aboard. By May of 1915, Britain and Germany were enemies in a widening war. Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone, and German submarines were operating there as instruments of blockade and pressure. In that world, a British vessel approaching the British Isles could be treated by Germany not as a neutral object, but as part of the enemy's maritime life. This was exactly where law, practice, technology, and morality collided. Older expectations at sea had imagined that a merchant ship might be stopped, searched, and, if it was to be destroyed, that crew and passengers would be given some chance to leave. But the submarine changed the practical equation. A U-boat was small, vulnerable on the surface, and dependent on surprise. Germany's war zone policy pushed against older prize rule practice. Lusitania's passengers paid the cost of that collision. They were not soldiers, yet they were traveling on a British liner in a place Germany had already warned was dangerous. Germany also pointed to the warnings published before Lusitania sailed from New York on May 1, 1915. The German embassy had cautioned travelers in American newspapers about sailing through the war zone on British or Allied ships. Those notices did not empty the ship. They did not persuade many passengers that a major liner would actually be attacked without being stopped. But after the sinking, Germany could say the danger had been publicly announced. The warning became part of the German case. People had been told the ship had sailed anyway, and the commander of U-20 had found an enemy vessel in the zone Germany had declared. For many in Britain and the United States, that argument felt brutally inadequate. A warning printed in a newspaper did not become a license to kill civilians at sea. A declared zone did not erase neutral rights. A ship's nationality did not make every child aboard a combatant. This was the heart of the diplomatic outrage. Germany was trying to describe Lusitania as a legitimate wartime target. Its critics were describing the passengers as protected human beings who had been given no real chance of survival once the torpedo struck. Then came the cargo question. the most persistent and often the most distorted part of the controversy. Sources agree that Lusitania carried ammunition or war materiel. That point cannot honestly be treated as invention. The ship was not carrying only luggage, mail, food, and ordinary commercial goods. It was also carrying material connected to war. Germany seized on that fact as proof that the liner was not simply a civilian passenger ship in the moral sense presented by British Outrage. If ammunition or war material was aboard, Germany argued, then the ship's status was compromised. It could be portrayed as helping Britain's war effort while carrying passengers through dangerous waters. But accepting that war material was aboard is not the same as accepting every dramatic claim made about it. This is where the historian has to move carefully. The presence of ammunition or war material is established in the broad outlines. The claim that this cargo explains everything about the disaster is not established in the same way. Lusitania was torpedoed on the starboard side by U-20. Witnesses and later accounts described a second, larger or different explosion soon afterward. The ship then sank with astonishing speed, commonly given as about 18 minutes, sometimes phrased as within 20 minutes. That second explosion became the opening through which suspicion entered. If there was war materiel aboard, did it explode? Did it contribute to the speed of the sinking? Did it turn a severe torpedo strike into a fatal structural collapse? These questions have never fully disappeared. Proposed explanations have included steam, coal, structural failure, and cargo-related possibilities. The difficulty is that the existence of the cargo does not by itself prove the cause of the second explosion, and the second explosion does not by itself prove that ammunition destroyed the ship from within. That distinction matters. Without it, the story slides too easily into certainty where the evidence remains debated. It is true that war materiel was aboard. It is also true that Germany used that fact to defend the attack and to challenge British and American anger. But the exact role of the cargo in Lusitania's rapid sinking remains debated. The ship's destruction happened in a complex physical moment. A torpedo impact, internal damage, the behavior of steam and coal, the possible effects of structural failure, and the unknown interaction of materials carried below. The disaster was real enough without inventing a single simple mechanism to explain it. The cargo question also does not erase the human question. Even if Germany believed Lusitania was carrying war material, the attack was made without stopping the ship and evacuating the people aboard. The dead included passengers and crew, with approximately 128 Americans among them. The total loss is reported with small variations by different institutions, generally around 1,191 to 1,198, often rounded to roughly 1,200. Those numbers remained central because diplomacy is not conducted only over the classification of cargo. It is also conducted over the protection of human life. In Germany's view, Britain had blurred the line between civilian shipping and war supply. In Britain's view, Germany had violated a basic moral boundary by sending a passenger liner to the bottom. In the United States, the controversy was sharper because the nation was still neutral. Americans were not prepared to accept that their citizens lost all protection simply by boarding a British liner. At the same time, the knowledge that the ship carried war material complicated the public debate over neutrality and trade. Could a neutral country remain emotionally distant when its citizens traveled on belligerent ships? Could it remain legally detached when goods from its ports moved toward a war zone? Lusitania forced those questions into public view. This is why the argument over cargo became larger than the cargo itself. It became an argument over what kind of world the war had created. Before the torpedo, a passenger liner like Lusitania still carried the memory of an older Atlantic. Schedules, tickets, dining rooms, mail contracts, business travel, family journeys. After the sinking, the same ship could be described by one side as a floating community of civilians, and by the other as an enemy vessel transporting useful material to a belligerent power. Both descriptions touched something real. Neither could make the other disappear. The danger lies in letting one truth consume all the rest. To say that Lusitania carried war materiel is not to say that every passenger accepted the risks of military service. To say that civilians died unlawfully or outrageously is not to say the cargo controversy was fabricated from nothing. The historical record is more uncomfortable than either slogan. The ship was a British passenger liner. It was sailing through a declared war zone. Warnings had been published. War material was aboard. A German submarine attacked without stopping and evacuating the ship. The sinking was rapid and devastating. The second explosion remains debated. The civilian deaths produced international outrage that no cargo manifest could simply cancel. For Germany, the defense was meant to limit responsibility. For Britain, the sinking became proof of German ruthlessness. For the United States, it became a diplomatic crisis that could not be solved by anger alone. President Woodrow Wilson now had to answer a question that was both legal and emotional. What did Germany owe the United States for the American lives lost on Lusitania? And what would the United States do if Germany refused to accept that responsibility? The debate over the ship's status and cargo did not settle the crisis. It hardened it. Germany had its argument. Britain had its symbol. America had its dead. And in Washington, grief and outrage began to move into the language of notes, demands, resignations, and policy. The disaster had become more than a story of what happened off Ireland on May 7, 1915. It had become a test of whether neutral rights and civilian life could still be defended in a war at sea that was changing faster than diplomacy could contain. The debate over the ship's status and cargo did not end the crisis. It moved the crisis into another arena, where words had to carry the weight of lives lost at sea. In Washington, the sinking of Lusitania became a problem of statecraft: how to answer Germany without abandoning neutrality, how to defend American citizens without rushing the country into war, and how to speak firmly enough that the deaths off Ireland would not become a precedent. President Woodrow Wilson did not ask Congress for a declaration of war in 1915. That fact is essential to the story, because Lusitania is often remembered as if it pulled the United States directly into the First World War. It did not. The United States remained neutral after the sinking. The American declaration of war would not come until April 6, 1917, after a broader crisis that included Germany's renewed unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. But if Lusitania did not bring immediate war, it did change the air in Washington. It narrowed the distance between American neutrality and American danger. Approximately 128 American citizens had died when U-20 torpedoed the British liner off the southern coast of Ireland near the old head of Kinsale. Those deaths made the war at sea personal for a nation that was still officially outside the conflict. Wilson's response was diplomatic, but it was not passive. His administration protested to Germany and demanded that American lives be protected. The issue was not only whether Lusitania had been British, or whether it had carried war material, or whether Germany had warned travelers that British and Allied ships were at risk in the declared war zone around Britain. For Washington, the central question was whether a belligerent power could destroy a passenger ship without first stopping it and giving non-combatants a chance to escape. That question cut to the heart of older maritime expectations. Before submarine warfare transformed the danger, there had been a legal and moral assumption that merchant vessels and passenger ships occupied a different category from warships. Prize rule practice expected a vessel to be stopped, searched, and, if necessary, evacuated before being destroyed. The submarine made that tradition difficult to sustain because a U-boat that surfaced beside a ship risked becoming vulnerable itself. Germany argued from military necessity and from the War Zone Declaration. Wilson's government argued from neutral rights and civilian life. This was the tension inside the American protest. Wilson had to speak for the dead without turning grief into a declaration of war. He had to defend Americans who traveled on the ships of belligerent nations, even when those ships crossed dangerous waters. He had to insist that Germany recognize responsibility, or at least accept limits, while still keeping the United States out of the conflict that was consuming Europe. Within his own administration, that balance was not simple. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan stood at the center of the early diplomatic response. Bryan was one of the best-known political figures in the United States, and he was also a committed pacifist. He believed deeply in peace and was wary of steps that might draw the country closer to war. The Lusitania crisis placed him in an almost impossible position. The administration needed to answer Germany forcefully, but Bryan feared that forceful words could become a bridge to armed conflict. In June of 1915, Bryan resigned. His resignation was one of the clearest signs that the sinking had created not only an international crisis, but also a domestic one inside the machinery of American policy. The disagreement was not over whether the loss of life mattered. It was over what kind of answer might protect American rights without making war more likely. Bryan's departure revealed how narrow Wilson's path had become. After Bryan, Robert Lansing took on the role of Secretary of State later in 1915. Lansing brought a different legal and diplomatic temperament to the crisis. Where Bryan was identified with pacifism and caution, Lansing became associated with a firmer interpretation of American rights. Under Wilson, the United States continued to press Germany over the submarine issue, but the central problem remained unresolved. What did Germany owe for the American lives lost on Lusitania, and what assurances would it give about the future? The difficulty was that each side was defending a principle it considered essential. Germany insisted that Britain's use of the seas, the declared war zone, and the character of ships like Lusitania changed the rules. The United States insisted that neutral citizens did not lose their right to life because they had boarded a passenger liner, even a British one, and even one sailing through dangerous waters. The ship's cargo and the German warnings could complicate the story, but they did not, in Wilson's view, erase the duty to protect civilians. So the argument continued through notes, replies, interpretations, and delays. Diplomacy can seem quiet compared with the violence of a torpedo strike, but in this case it carried its own pressure. Every word mattered, because every word suggested what the United States might accept, what Germany might repeat, and what future passengers might face. A weak protest could imply consent. A harsh protest could help pull the country closer to war. Wilson's task was to hold the line between those dangers. By November 19, 1915, the impasse was still serious enough that Robert Lansing wrote to President Wilson about it. His letter concerned the continuing deadlock with Germany over liability for American lives lost on Lusitania. Months had passed since the ship went down and about 18 minutes off Ireland, yet the political and legal consequences remained unsettled. The bodies had been buried. The newspapers had moved through waves of shock and argument. But in Washington, the question of responsibility had not disappeared. That November letter matters because it shows how long the disaster stayed alive inside American diplomacy. Lusitania was not merely a few days of outrage after May 7th. It became a file that would not close, a grievance that returned whenever Germany's submarine policy was discussed, a reminder that neutral Americans had already died in a war the United States had not joined. The crisis did not move in a straight line from sinking to declaration of war. It moved in stages: grief, protest, argument, hesitation, renewed pressure, and memory. Germany did moderate its submarine warfare after American pressure in 1915, but the underlying conflict was not solved. The same questions remained beneath the surface. Could Germany wage submarine war around Britain without killing neutral civilians? Could the United States remain neutral while Americans traveled, traded, and sailed through the sea lanes of belligerents? Could international law keep pace with machines designed to strike from underwater and disappear? Wilson's refusal to go to war in 1915 was not indifference. It was a choice to give diplomacy room to work. But the Lusitania protest also marked a change in American neutrality. Before the sinking, the European war could still seem distant to many Americans, even when their economy and travel touched it. After the sinking, neutrality had to be defended against a harsher reality. Americans had died not on a battlefield, but on a passenger route between New York and Liverpool. They had been passengers on a British liner, yet their deaths became an American diplomatic claim. This is why Lusitania pulled America toward war without immediately bringing it there. The disaster created a moral account that remained open. Wilson protested, Bryan resigned, Lansing pressed the issue, and Germany resisted full acceptance of American demands. The result was not war in 1915, but a deeper suspicion, a sharper public anger, and a diplomatic record that would shape how later submarine attacks were understood. By the end of that year, Lusitania existed in several forms at once. It was a wreck off the Irish coast. It was a list of the dead. It was a dispute over cargo and war zone warnings. It was a series of American protests and German replies. And increasingly, it was becoming an image, a story condensed into symbols that could be printed, circulated, praised, condemned, and used. Governments and publics were no longer arguing only over what had happened. They were fighting over what the sinking would mean. The argument over Lusitania had moved from diplomacy into memory. Once the notes had been written, once Wilson had protested and Germany had answered, the sinking did not remain confined to government files. It entered newspapers, posters, speeches, private grief, and public anger. It became a story people could carry with them, not only as a fact, but as an image. And in wartime, images could travel faster than careful explanations. For Britain, Lusitania was a powerful symbol because it made the war at sea visible in human terms. The ship had not been a battleship in the public imagination. It had been a Cunard passenger liner, sailing a familiar route from New York to Liverpool. It had carried families, travelers, crew, and American citizens at a moment when the United States was still officially neutral. When it was torpedoed by U-20 off the southern coast of Ireland near the old head of Kinsale on May 7, 1915, and sank in about 18 minutes, the disaster seemed to compress the anxieties of the age into a single scene: civilians at sea, modern machinery, and a weapon that struck without the older ritual of stopping a ship and removing those aboard. That was the British emphasis. It was not only that nearly 1,200 people had died, though the scale of death gave the story its weight. It was that they had died aboard a passenger ship on a route associated with ordinary transatlantic life. British propaganda could present Lusitania as evidence that Germany had crossed a moral boundary. The torpedo became more than a naval act. It became an accusation. The dead became witnesses in a political argument about civilization, law, and the treatment of civilians in war. In the United States, the same image had a different force. Americans were not yet belligerents. President Woodrow Wilson had not asked Congress for war. His administration had protested, demanded protection for American lives, and insisted that neutral citizens could not simply be treated as acceptable losses inside a declared war zone. But public feeling did not wait for diplomacy to finish its work. The deaths of approximately 128 Americans gave the disaster a direct emotional claim on the American public. It was no longer only European violence seen from a distance. It had reached into American families, American newspapers, and American politics. Newspaper coverage helped turn Lusitania into a shared event. Early reports tried to measure the disaster even before the final toll was clear. Later accounts fixed the sinking in public memory as a moment of shock: a famous liner, a sudden attack, lifeboats under terrible pressure, and the sea closing over a ship that had represented speed, wealth, and imperial confidence. Each retelling simplified the complexity. Cargo disputes, war zone notices, and legal arguments remained important, but they did not carry the same immediate power as the image of civilians lost in minutes. Germany understood this battle over meaning and answered it with its own account. German officials and defenders pointed to the facts they believed changed the moral frame. Lusitania was a British ship. It had sailed into waters Germany had declared a war zone. Warnings had appeared in American newspapers before the final voyage, cautioning travelers about the risks of sailing on British or Allied ships through those waters. And Lusitania was carrying ammunition or war material. To Germany, these facts mattered because they made the liner part of the war system that Britain was using against Germany. This was not only a legal defense, it was also a propaganda defense. Germany needed to resist the image of helpless civilians murdered without context. It sought instead to present the sinking as a harsh but justified act in a war zone against a ship tied to the British war effort. In that version, the warning notices became central. The declared war zone became central. The cargo became central. The ship was not remembered only as a passenger liner, but as a British vessel moving through a military conflict with material useful to war. The difficulty was that both forms of memory could draw on real elements of the case. It was true that civilians died in large numbers, including Americans. It was true that the ship was attacked without being stopped and evacuated under older prize rule practice. It was also true that Germany had issued warnings, had declared the waters around Britain a war zone, and argued from the presence of war materiel aboard. The propaganda battle worked by deciding which truths would dominate the picture and which would be pushed to the edge. That is why the Lusitania medal became so controversial. A medal is a small object, but it can carry a large argument. Its imagery transformed the sinking into something solid, repeatable, and portable. It could be held in the hand as a judgment on the event. To some, such imagery seemed to show German approval or even celebration of a civilian disaster. To others, it belonged to the German claim that Lusitania had not been an innocent voyage, but a ship moving through a warned war zone with cargo connected to war. The medal became part of the same struggle that filled newspapers and diplomatic correspondence. What kind of event had the sinking been? The importance of the medal was not only in the object itself, but in the reaction to it. Once imagery enters propaganda, it does not belong only to the people who first produce it. Opponents can seize it, reproduce it, reinterpret it, and use it as evidence of character. In British and American hands, controversial Lusitania imagery could be turned back against Germany. It could suggest callousness. It could make the sinking appear not as a tragic necessity of submarine warfare, but as something marked, commemorated, and morally exposed. The medal therefore became a weapon in memory's second battle, not the attack on the ship, but the attack on reputation. This is how Lusitania moved from disaster into symbol. The ship had already been many things: a Cunard liner, a Royal Mail ship, a fast Atlantic vessel, a wartime target, a diplomatic crisis, and a wreck lying off Ireland. Propaganda added another layer. Lusitania became a shorthand for the vulnerability of civilians in modern war. It became a way to talk about neutral rights without quoting diplomatic notes. It became a way to argue about German submarine warfare without explaining every rule and exception. It allowed grief to take visual form. But symbols are powerful partly because they are incomplete. The Lusitania symbol could not hold every detail at once. It could not easily contain the grief of families, the technical uncertainty around the second explosion, the disputed meaning of the cargo, the legal arguments over the war zone, and the slow caution of Wilson's diplomacy. So public memory selected. Britain and many Americans emphasized the dead, the passengers, the absence of warning before the torpedo struck, and the moral shock. Germany emphasized the published warnings, the declared war zone, the ship's British identity, and the cargo. Each side accused the other of distortion. Each side believed the missing context changed the meaning. For the American public, this mattered because the United States was still deciding what kind of nation it would be in relation to the European war. Lusitania did not force that decision immediately. The country did not enter the war in 1915. Yet the disaster made neutrality more emotionally difficult. It attached names and faces to submarine warfare. It created a memory that could be recalled whenever Germany's U-boat policy returned to the center of the crisis. Later events would not fall on untouched ground. They would fall on a public already shaped by Lusitania. By the end of the propaganda battle, no single version had erased the others. The British and American image of civilian victimhood remained strong. The German argument over warnings, war zones, and cargo did not disappear. The medal and its imagery showed how even an object could become a battlefield, carrying accusation and defense in metal form. Lusitania had become more than a sunken ship. It had become an unresolved moral account, preserved in mourning, contested in argument, and ready to return when the war at sea widened again. That unresolved memory would matter in the final movement toward war. The path from May of 1915 to April of 1917 was not a straight line from one torpedo to one declaration. It was a long wake: shock, protest, propaganda, restraint, renewed danger, and finally a broader crisis that made neutrality impossible to sustain. Lusitania did not alone bring America into the First World War, but it changed the waters through which American opinion and policy would have to pass. The unresolved memory of Lusitania did not fade when the first wave of posters, headlines, protests, and arguments passed. It remained in the background of the war at sea, like a wake that could still be seen long after the ship itself had gone under. In May of 1915, the disaster had not carried the United States directly into war, but it had changed the emotional and diplomatic weather. It made the submarine campaign visible to American families. It gave the abstract language of neutral rights a human cost, and it left Washington with a question that could not be answered once and for all. What would happen if Germany returned to a wider war against shipping? For President Woodrow Wilson, the answer in 1915 was not immediate war. It was protest, pressure, and a demand that American lives be protected. That distinction matters because the story of Lusitania is often remembered as if one torpedo led straight to one declaration. The real path was slower, more contested, and more revealing. The United States was still neutral when the liner left New York for Liverpool. It was still neutral after U-20 struck her off the southern coast of Ireland. It was still neutral after the casualty lists made clear that approximately 128 Americans were among the dead. The disaster moved American opinion, but it did not erase American hesitation. That hesitation was not indifference. The sinking had made it far harder for many Americans to view the European war as distant. A Cunard liner on the familiar North Atlantic route had been destroyed, not after passengers and crew were removed, but in a sudden attack under the new logic of submarine warfare. The ship went down in about 18 minutes, and nearly 1,200 people died. Those facts gave the crisis a moral force that diplomatic notes alone could not contain. Yet, the United States in 1915 was still a country arguing over what neutrality meant. Could Americans travel on British ships through a declared war zone? Could Germany lawfully attack a passenger liner it believed was carrying war materiel? Could a neutral government defend its citizens without becoming a belligerent itself? Lusitania sharpened every one of those questions. Germany insisted that the ship was British, that the waters around Britain had been declared a war zone, and that cargo aboard the vessel included ammunition or war mater sale. Britain and many Americans answered from another moral center. The ship had carried civilians, including women, children, and neutral citizens, and it had been destroyed without the kind of warning and evacuation older maritime expectations required. The argument over law, warning, and cargo did not cancel the grief. The grief did not settle the law. Both remained. For a time, American pressure helped restrain the crisis. Germany suspended or moderated unrestricted submarine warfare after the American protests of 1915. That did not mean the dispute over Lusitania was solved. Robert Lansing's November letter to Wilson that year showed that the question of liability for American lives lost was still unresolved. The disaster lingered in official language as well as public memory. It was not only a wound, it was an unfinished diplomatic account. Then, in early 1917, the war at sea widened again. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. The policy struck at the heart of what the United States had been arguing since Lusitania, that neutral lives and neutral commerce could not simply be absorbed into a military calculation without consequence. The earlier disaster gave Americans a memory through which to understand the renewed danger. The issue was no longer theoretical. They had already seen what could happen when a passenger ship met a submarine in a declared war zone. Even then, Lusitania was not the only cause of American entry into the First World War. The final crisis was broader. Renewed unrestricted submarine warfare came alongside the Zimmermann telegram, which intensified American alarm and helped change the political balance in Washington. Wilson addressed Congress on April 2, 1917. 4 days later, on April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. By then, Lusitania had been at the bottom off Ireland for nearly 2 years. That passage of time is important. It shows that history did not move in a single dramatic leap. It moved through accumulation. Shock became argument. Argument became policy. Policy met new danger. Memory gave new events a sharper edge. The sinking did not force America into war in the spring of 1915, but it made it harder for the United States to remain untouched by the war's methods. It helped transform submarine warfare from a distant naval tactic into a direct challenge to American life, law, and honor. The disaster also changed how people imagined the sea itself. Before the war, the great liners had stood for confidence. Engines, schedules, electric lights, dining rooms, mail contracts, and the steady traffic between New York and Liverpool. Lusitania had embodied that world with unusual force. She was a Royal Mail ship of the Cunard line, built for speed and prestige, a vessel whose name belonged to the age of turbines, quadruple screws, great boilers, and the blue riband imagination of the Atlantic. Her loss made clear that the ocean had been transformed. A passenger route could become a battle space. A civilian voyage could become part of a diplomatic crisis. A ship built to cross the Atlantic in triumph could vanish in minutes near the old head of Kinsale. That is why the wreck still matters. Lusitania is not only a subject for old newspapers or wartime speeches. The wreck lies off the southern coast of Ireland, connected to the waters where the disaster unfolded and to the communities that saw the aftermath come ashore. It is treated as protected Irish underwater cultural heritage, a site with archaeological, legal, and memorial significance. That protection recognizes that the remains are not merely debris from a famous ship. They are the material trace of a mass casualty event, a place where a global war touched individual lives with devastating speed. Objects recovered or preserved from the ship carry some of that meaning into the present. A four-bladed port-side propeller from Lusitania, held by National Museum's Liverpool, weighs about 22.5 tons. It is a piece of engineering, but it is also a witness. Metal that once belonged to a symbol of movement and power now speaks to loss, memory, and the fragility of human confidence. The scale of such an artifact reminds us what the ship was. The silence of the wreck reminds us what happened to her. Over time, Lusitania has been pulled into many kinds of stories. It has been used as evidence of German brutality, as an example of British propaganda, as a case study in maritime law, as a mystery around cargo and explosions, and as a turning point in American opinion. Each of those stories contains part of the truth, but none of them alone is enough. The sinking was a disaster at sea. It was also a diplomatic crisis. It was a propaganda battle. It was a private grief multiplied across families and nations. And it was one stage in the long movement that carried the United States from neutrality to war. To say that Lusitania pulled America toward war is not to say that it pulled America all the way. The distinction is the lesson. Nations often enter wars not after one event, but after a chain of events has narrowed the space for restraint. In that chain, Lusitania was one of the most powerful links. It hardened opinion. It gave Wilson's protests urgency. It made unrestricted submarine warfare seem not only dangerous, but morally intolerable to many Americans. And when Germany resumed that warfare in 1917, the memory of the lost liner returned with force. So the final image is not simply the torpedo or the second explosion or the great ship sliding beneath the water. It is the wake afterward, widening across the Atlantic, moving through newspapers and diplomatic notes, through medals and posters, through family mourning and congressional debate. It is the space between May 7, 1915 and April 6, 1917, when outrage did not instantly become war, but did not disappear either. Lusitania remains there in that long wake. A ship on a New York to Liverpool route. A wreck off Ireland. A protected underwater heritage site. A name that still asks how civilians are drawn into war, how memory shapes policy, and how slowly a neutral nation can be carried toward a decision it once hoped to avoid.